Verses like this have such weight because it tells us what will really happen when we fully embrace the gospel in our lives and begin to live it out. A tree is known by its fruit. So if you aren't being persecuted, are you truly living the message of the gospel? Are you spreading it? This is a tough question these days because it can be tough. We don't normally seek out discomfort and uncomfortable situations. What is up, party people? Brad Large back with you again. We are in Matthew. This is week 5. This is self-paced Bible studies. You do you go at your own pace. You learn as much of the Bible as you want. Please. That's what I do. I love it. That's why I make these videos, because I'm constantly doing, I've done 3 weeks of one of the Bible studies in the past 4 days. I love it, right? And it's just filling me up with God's word so that I can hopefully overflow some goodness for somebody out there and be positive influence on the world and have good conversations and drive things forward. But we are in week 5 of the Matthew's Gospel Bible Study, section 2, and this is going over chapters 8 through 10. So reread that before you do these videos. But Jesus' mission for his disciples. How do the disciples' mission mirror Jesus' ministry? What kinds of warm and fuzzies do you get from reading this section? And we're going to talk about Jesus saying that he didn't come to bring peace but a sword. So, always a fun time when the swords get brought out. And with that, let's go. In this section, we're going over how do the disciples' mission mirror Jesus' ministry? How do what Jesus tells the disciples to do and what they go out and do, how does that look like Jesus' ministry? Go ahead and pause it for a second after any of these questions, okay? Make this as interactive as you want. Authority over the unclean spirits. Jesus gives them authority over unclean spirits to cast them out. He tells them to heal every affliction and disease. He tells them to go to the lost sheep of Israel, right? Jesus, in this Matthew's gospel, it's very focused on Gentile interactions, which is funny, but it's also focused mainly on Jesus ministering to Israel and being intentional about coming to Israel. He tells them to go to the people they're familiar with. This is a very important point that I'm going to get to in just a second. He tells them to heal the sick and raise the dead. And then he tells them to cleanse lepers. How is this different than heal the sick? This always made me think that there is some kind of symbolism in the Bible with different diseases, the lame, blind, deaf, and lepers. And when it's funny because lepers are like insensitive. So I didn't know this, but leprosy means that people cannot feel. Their nervous system's breaking down. So if you get a cut, you might go to wash your hands and it's boiling water and you don't feel it. So your finger doesn't feel that it's boiling water. Back then when they were sanitizing, this would have been a bigger issue. Or they don't recognize they're getting sunburnt and get blisters, which could become infected back then. Like all these different things just from having this unfeeling lack of sensation in your hand. It's amazing to me. So when we look at that from that perspective, I wonder if that's saying something about these different periods of Jesus' healing, that what he's healing is this insensitivity. And when I look around the world, and I know that sin is sin, and it's always been the same, I feel like this desensitization of sin and wickedness and evil and just this idea that we're allowing this to happen is so prevalent. And I wonder if there's something there. One thing I will point out about the disciples' mission mirroring Jesus is that Jesus starts in Israel. So Jesus came to reconcile all nations as the Messiah. He came for everybody, right? But he actually starts in Israel, and he tells the disciples to start in Israel. And oftentimes I see a lot of people, and I'm guilty of this myself. I actually just recently started praying about this and thinking, God, you sent Jesus to Israel. And then he told the disciples to go to Israel. Who are the people directly around you that if they are Christians, this is going to be even easier, but if they're not Christians, that you can evangelize to? And what does that look like? And to me, personally, when I look around the world, there are so many broken relationships. I have broken relationships with people. So how do you set the bone? To me, the most loving Christian thing we can do right now is start setting the bone on the relationships with people around us, rejecting shallow friendships, meeting people where they are and loving people for sure, but not tolerating this idea that we are just going to hobble along with broken relationships. We need to look for those relationships with Christians and non-Christians around us and be a light by showing them the correct way, by not tolerating having a bad relationship, but showing them how to do that. And evangelizing can be that simple. I'm thinking of an example where I really just want to set some relationships right. I can think of multiple examples where I can come off as a jerk, and I can come off as brash, and I can come off as a know-it-all or whatever. So fixing that to me is the easiest way to evangelize. Just showing people the beauty of a life lived in God and what those relationships look like, how healing and life-giving those relationships are versus the other relationships. Just wanted to hit that nail on the head. Hopefully I did. What kinds of warm and fuzzies do you get reading verses 16 through 22? And so this is chapter 10, verses 16 through 22. I'm going to read it, and I want you to tell me what kind of warm and fuzzies you get from this verse. Behold, I'm sending you out as sheep in the midst of wolves. So be wise as serpents and innocent as doves. Beware of men, for they will deliver you over to courts and flog you in their synagogues. You will be dragged before governors and kings for my sake, to bear witness before them and the Gentiles. When they deliver you over, do not be anxious about how you are to speak or what you are to say, for what you are to say will be given to you in that hour. For it is not you who speak, but the Spirit of our Father speaking through you. Brother will deliver brother over to death, and the father his child, and children will rise up against their parents and have them put to death, and you will be hated by all for my name's sake. But the one who endures by the end will be saved. Was that just for the disciples, or is that for us? Because there have been times in recent history where martyrs were a thing. And so I think about that, and I wonder, how is it that I don't even have enough spine to step up against some of the evil and wicked that I see in the world now, when there were so many people willing to give their lives for that? This persecution, we are being sent to the wolves. I covered that in a couple sections ago, a couple weeks ago, I think. There's a section about that. Jesus promises persecution. Again, I've been on a Vodi Bakum kick lately, and he had this wonderful thing to do where he said, if I'm living in the spheres that God has given me, my family, my church, my government, my magistrate, my community, if I'm living a godly life and standing up for a godly life, I am promised that the fight is going to find me. You will be persecuted. And if you're not, why aren't you? I think it's an important question. What kind of warm and fuzzies did you get from reading that? Persecution's guaranteed. You are sheep sent among the wolves. They'll try to flog you and punish you. Have you ever disciplined a kid who knew they did the wrong thing? That's what this verse makes me think about. These verses make me think about this example. Have you ever had to discipline a kid who knew they did the wrong thing? Like when my kid, I look at them and I go, did you do that? And they're like, yeah, I know they did it. First, they look mad. Then they try to explain what happened. Like yeah, I did a bad thing, but here's why. And it's usually not a very good reason. But then the weight of what they did kind of dawns on them, and they get kind of ashamed and sad and upset. And that's, as a parent, when your heart breaks. Because your kid's a good kid when they recognize that. Because they're convicted by that. They know right from wrong. And that makes you proud. But there's also got to be, you have to discipline a child so that they don't go the bad route. And it's tough. It's tough to grow out of that. And what's funny to me is I think of that sometimes and still see it in adults today when they're called out for doing something wrong. We are not above Jesus, and the worldly do not like the message we bring. The evil don't like the message we bring. And in fact, the gospel message, later Paul says that to some it's the breath of life and to others the stench of death, right? Like this idea that the gospel, to those that are alive, it is life-giving, and to those that are dead, it smells like death. Because it is. We have to die to our sin and our wickedness and repent. So it smells like death. It feels horrible. It looks bad. But that's the cost of approaching God's throne. We cannot approach the way that we are. We have to die to our sin. This is another one that I love. Jesus says he didn't come to bring peace but a sword. So I think about this in a couple different ways, but there are a lot of clues in Matthew that the people wanted Jesus to violently overthrow the Romans. They were expecting the Messiah to come and bring a sword. So when he says, I haven't come to bring peace but a sword, do you think it's kind of like all those 3%ers in America or Christian nationalists that want to conflict, and they were like, yeah, that's what I'm talking about. Like, it's time. How disappointed do you think they were? What does this passage mean now that we know what happened to Jesus? Does Jesus' message bring us closer to people or alienate us from them? This is a tough question in light of this passage, because what it does is it separates us, like Jesus' message separates us from many worldly secular things, from family, and we are called to love him more than anything else. There's a separating element here. There's a violent separation happening. A sword is a violent separation. It brings us closer to believers, though, doesn't it? Like, we have something in common. We are one body in Christ. So we are called to be a whole body there. So we shouldn't be turning the sword on the body. That's not cool. But it definitely pushes non-believers away. If we embrace this, what does it mean for us? That we always need to embrace Christ, that we always need to put God first, that we need to worship and submit ourselves to that, first and foremost, in every area of our life, and be uncompromising in that. And that takes a lot of growing. I'm not there. I find new areas of my life every day that I submit to God. I pray, God, take this area of my life, please, because I just recognized how I'm trying to run it. What are some of the consequences of this you have seen in your life? And does this verse give you hope, or is it kind of scary? Verses like this have such weight because it tells us what will really happen when we fully embrace the gospel in our lives and begin to live it out. A tree is known by its fruit. So if you aren't being persecuted, are you truly living the message of the gospel? Are you spreading it? This is a tough question these days because it can be tough. We don't normally seek out discomfort and uncomfortable situations. How do we show the message in a loving and true way in the face of persecution? This is something that I've just recently been willing to do, is put myself out there, put my beliefs out there, and allow other people to attack them. I feel persecuted, but the greatest gift of that is that I really have to question and challenge what I believe and understand it in a deeper way. So I would really challenge and encourage you to pick a way in which you can put yourself out there as a Christian, as submitting yourself to God, standing up for the right thing, or healing a broken relationship, and just saying, I'm doing this because I'm submitting myself to God. So with that, we're into the theological theme. So we're going to talk about the mission. So Jesus sends his disciples on a mission. The motivation of the mission cannot be about us and our reward, right? Like, what motivates the mission is glorifying God. And so as we look at this mission and us going out into the world, we need to remember that it's about God's glory. It's about compassion being a key component here. Us being compassionate reflects God's compassion and Jesus' compassion. And Jesus sees people in sin and trouble and circumstances outside their control, and he offers them grace, healing, and salvation. It's his compassion where we see his love expressed the most. One thing about this, there's not a single example of someone coming to him and following him without a change to that person. Jesus doesn't affirm anyone. Jesus shoots holes in people's logical minds and hearts when they're coming to him for affirmation. Jesus makes it easy for them, though, because it's about God's glory. It's not about affirming you as a person. So when we go on mission, we have to be clear that it's about glorifying God. It is not about affirming or glorifying yourself. It's dying to yourself. Kingdom restoration, right? Jesus sets the foundation and brings the kingdom, and we are called to disciple and spread the message of this kingdom. Jesus' miracles in Matthew show the nature of the kingdom of heaven and illustrate that it's not just talk. It's Jesus is doing things. It's spiritual, but it's also bodily. One thing about Gnostic thought is that spirit is all that matters. Like, we fall into Gnosticism if we think that spirit is the end-all be-all. And one thing about hedonism is that spirit doesn't matter. It's all about feeling good and pleasure and, that animalistic and bodily, undisciplined, no self-control, just feeding your passions. Christianity affirms the goodness of spirituality and the physical. I mean, it's really a beautiful marriage of this. The kingdom's for your spirit, but it's also for the restoration of the physical as well. We're being reconciled to God to continuously be a part of restoring the kingdom of heaven. And the last theological concept is faith. Faith to me has become like a really scary concept. Faith is so much more than looking at facts and being comforted. Having faith in Jesus is a very scary proposition after reading the book of Matthew. Not going to lie. It is a very scary proposition to have faith in Jesus. Jesus flat out discourages people from following him in Matthew. Faith means living a certain way. It means giving yourself to God. Having faith and believing in that faith is a submission to God. It is a worship of God. To have faith is to believe. You believe it so much that you live it. It's not some intellectual exercise. Faith isn't. It's lived. And we see that in the Apostle Paul. This is why it's so confusing to talk about faith versus works, because if you have faith, the works are a given. When we put our faith in anything other than Jesus, we're misplacing it. So I used to think that this idea, when he would talk about having faith the size of a mustard seed and all these different things, that he was talking about having, faith in God. But, everybody has faith in something. And when we misplace that faith, it's as bad as not having it. It's the wrong faith. He's talking about having a qualitative and quantitative difference of faith, putting it in the wrong thing. When we put our faith in Jesus, he gives us the power to heal, to be healed, and to be saved. And by giving over our infirmities and our sin and our imperfections, God is going to transform that for his glory. And we benefit from that. But again, the point of the mission is glorifying God. And when we start to get that right, that it's not about us, everything else makes a lot more sense. So that's all I have for this week. I really appreciate you hanging out. Like and subscribe to the video, please. Put comments down below of what you thought about this section of Matthew and going through it. And with that, I will catch you in the next video. All right? Peace.